Las Vegas in the 1960s did not whisper. It roared. Neon lights blinked like restless eyes. Glasses clinked. Roulette wheels spun with the quiet promise of fortune or ruin. And on that particular night, the showroom at the Sands was packed wall-to-wall, celebrities in tuxedos, socialites in diamonds, men who controlled cities with a handshake and a nod. At the center of it all stood Dean Martin, relaxed, effortless, a glass in hand, the crowd eating out of his palm. Dean had that kind of power. He didn't chase attention. It followed him. Behind the curtain, adjusting his cufflinks with a quiet smile, was Sammy Davis Jr. Electric, sharp, endlessly talented. When Sammy stepped onto a stage, he didn't just perform. He owned it. They were brothers in rhythm and rebellion, part of the legendary Rat Pack, kings of cool in a city built on spectacle. But Vegas, for all its glitter, still carried shadows. And that night, one of those shadows wore a silk suit. At a front table sat a man everyone noticed but no one introduced loudly. He was a powerful underworld figure, a so-called businessman who financed hotels, backed performers, and expected respect the way kings expect tribute. When he laughed, people joined in, not because it was funny but because it was safer. Dean saw him the moment he walked on stage. He also saw Sammy glance toward that table and then quickly look away. The show began perfectly. Dean sang. The crowd swayed. Applause rose like a wave crashing against the stage. Halfway through the set, Sammy joined him. The chemistry was effortless, teasing banter. Sharp timing, the kind of humor that made audiences feel like insiders. Then it happened. Between jokes, the mob boss called out something from his table, a so-called joke aimed at Sammy. It wasn't clever. It wasn't playful. It carried the sting of prejudice dressed up as humor. For a split second, the room froze. Some people laughed nervously. Others stared into their drinks. A few looked at Dean, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Sammy stood still. He had heard worse in his life. Growing up in a segregated America had taught him to smile through poison. He had performed for crowds that adored his talent but wouldn't share a table with him afterward. He had learned to survive. But survival isn't the same as dignity. Dean didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He slowly lowered his glass. And in that pause, that heavy, electric pause, the entire room understood something was about to shift. Dean stepped closer to the microphone. His voice, usually lazy and smooth, came out steady and sharp. Funny thing about jokes, he said calmly, looking straight at the front table. They're supposed to make everybody laugh. Silence. The mob boss leaned back in his chair, amused, as if this were just another bit. Dean continued, Sammy's the most talented man in this building. The only joke here would be thinking he needs anyone's permission to stand on this stage. Murmur rippled through the audience. The boss's smile faded just slightly. Now, understand something about that era. Las Vegas wasn't just show business. It was power, money, influence. Careers could be made or erased depending on who you pleased. And Dean Martin had just drawn a line in front of one of the most powerful men in the room. Sammy shifted beside him, unsure where this was going. Dean put an arm around Sammy's shoulder. Not as a performance. Not as an act. But as a statement. If Sammy walks, Dean said, I walk. And if I walk, this place gets real quiet real fast. The message was clear. Respect wasn't optional. The air in the room felt tight, like a storm about to break. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, the mob boss stared back at Dean. This wasn't the reaction he expected. Entertainers usually played along, smiled, collected their checks. But this wasn't just any entertainer. This was Dean Martin, the man who could fill a room with a whisper. The boss forced a chuckle. Relax, he said loudly. Just kidding. Dean didn't blink. Good, he replied. Because I don't find that funny. A wave of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then louder. People weren't just clapping for a comeback. They were clapping for courage. Sammy felt something shift inside him, not pride, not exactly relief. For once, he wasn't standing alone. The show continued. Music returned. Laughter came back, this time real and warm. But something deeper had changed. Backstage later that night, Sammy approached Dean quietly. "You didn't have to do that," Sammy said. Dean shrugged. "Yeah, I did. There was no dramatic speech. No grand gesture. Just loyalty. But loyalty has a price. Word travels fast in a city like Las Vegas. By morning, whispers had spread through casinos and hotel corridors. Some admired Dean's stand. Others warned he had embarrassed a dangerous man. And dangerous men don't forget embarrassment. That night wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because respect, once defended publicly, demands to be defended again, especially when pride gets involved. And somewhere in the City of Lights, a powerful man was deciding whether Dean Martin had just crossed a line or drawn one. The morning after the show, Las Vegas felt different. Not louder, not brighter, heavier. In a city built on performance, everyone knew something real had happened the night before. At the Sands, conversation stopped when Dean Martin walked through the lobby. Dealers leaned closer to one another. Cocktail waitresses whispered. A few managers nodded respectfully. Others avoided eye contact. Respect in Vegas had layers. On the surface, it belonged to stars. Beneath that surface, it belonged to men who never stepped on stage. Dean knew that. He had grown up around tough neighborhoods. He understood pride. He understood power. But he also understood something else, that silence, when it protects wrong, becomes part of the wrong. In his suite, the phone rang before noon. He let it ring twice before answering. A calm voice on the other end requested a private meeting that evening. No threats. No raised tones. Just a time and a place. A restaurant off the strip. Back room. Dean hung up and stared out the window at the desert stretching beyond the glittering skyline of Las Vegas. The lights made the city look invincible at night. In daylight, you could see the dust. Later that afternoon, Sammy Davis Jr. knocked on Dean's door. Sammy didn't waste time. "You goin'?" he asked. Dean poured two coffees before answering. "Yeah," Sammy exhaled slowly. He had faced hostility his entire career. He knew how quickly admiration could turn to exclusion. A canceled show. A lost contract. A closed door. "They can make things hard," Sammy said quietly. Dean handed him the cup. "They already do," he replied. There was no anger in his voice. Just clarity. That evening, the restaurant was dim, quiet, controlled. The kind of place where deals were made without paper. The mob boss sat at the center of the table, surrounded by men who spoke little and observed everything. Dean entered alone. No manager. No lawyer. Just himself. He shook hands calmly and took his seat. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the boss leaned back, studying him. "You embarrassed me," he said plainly. Dean didn't rush to respond. "I corrected you," he answered. The room tightened. The boss tapped his fingers lightly on the table. "You think you run this town?" Dean shook his head. "No. I just run my stage." A long pause. Outside, traffic hummed faintly. Inside, even breathing felt measured. The boss wasn't used to resistance. Especially not in public. Especially not from someone whose career could be influenced by a few phone calls. "You know," the boss said slowly, "people like Sammy are lucky to be where they are." Dean's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "No," he said. "Places are lucky to have him." The words didn't explode. They landed solid. Unmoving. The men around the table shifted slightly. Some looked at the boss, waiting for his reaction. Power thrives on obedience, but power also calculates. The boss studied Dean carefully. "You're willing to risk business for that." Dean didn't blink. "I'm willing to risk business for respect." There it was. Not defiance for drama. Not rebellion for applause. A boundary. The kind that can't be negotiated once spoken aloud. The silence stretched longer this time. Finally, the boss leaned back and gave a thin smile. "You entertainers," he said, "always emotional." Dean stood slowly. "No," he replied calmly, "just human." He adjusted his jacket and walked out. No shouting followed him, no threats, but the tension lingered in the air long after he left. Back at the hotel, Sammy waited. Dean told him everything, no exaggeration, no heroics. Sammy listened quietly. "You could have stayed quiet," Sammy said after a moment. "Nobody would have blamed you." Dean looked at him seriously. "I would have." The words hit deeper than any applause. Over the next few days, rumors spread. Some said Dean would lose prime performance slots. Others said certain investors were unhappy. A few predicted the Rat Pack's dominance in Las Vegas might weaken. But something unexpected happened. Ticket sales didn't drop. They rose. People talked about what happened that night, not as gossip, but as a moment when someone powerful chose principle over comfort. A week later, during another sold-out show, Dean stepped onto the stage again. The crowd was louder than usual. Sammy joined him midway through the performance. And when Sammy began to sing, the applause came early, before the first note even finished. It wasn't sympathy. It was recognition. Dean glanced toward the front tables. The mob boss was not there. Maybe he stayed away by choice. Maybe he was sending a message. Either way, the stage felt different now, stronger, because courage, once displayed publicly, changes the atmosphere. Backstage after the show, Sammy turned to Dean. "You know this isn't over." "Right," Dean gave a small smile. "Maybe not," he said, "but some things are worth repeating." Outside, Las Vegas glittered as always. But beneath the neon lights, something subtle had shifted. Respect had been tested, and it had not bowed. The applause was louder than ever, but behind the curtains, the pressure was building. A week after the meeting, small changes began to appear. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just delays. A rehearsal slot suddenly double-booked. A private event quietly reassigned. A sponsorship. Dinner postponed without explanation. In Las Vegas. Power rarely shouted. It adjusted. Dean Martin noticed. He didn't complain. He didn't storm into offices. He simply watched. Sammy Davis Jr. noticed too. He had lived long enough in America to recognize when doors were being nudged instead of slammed. Discrimination did not always arrive with anger. Sometimes it arrived with polite inconvenience. One afternoon, the hotel's entertainment director asked to see Dean privately. The office blinds were half closed, stripes of desert sunlight cutting across the carpet. "This doesn't have to be difficult," the director began carefully. "We just need smoother relationships." Dean leaned back in his chair. "With who?" The director hesitated. "Investors." There it was. Again, the invisible word. Investors, money, influence. "If things cool down," the director continued, "maybe you could avoid public commentary." Dean's voice stayed calm. "You mean avoid defending my friend?" The director shifted uncomfortably. "You made your point." Dean stood. "No," he said quietly. "I made my position." And he walked out. That night, the showroom felt charged, not tense or aware. The audience had heard rumors. So had the press. Sammy stood backstage, adjusting his tie, staring at his reflection longer than usual. "You sure about this?" he asked when Dean approached. Dean nodded, more sure than last time. They stepped onto the stage together. The crowd rose to its feet before a word was spoken. Dean let the applause settle. He didn't mention names. He didn't reference meetings. He didn't attack anyone. Instead, he did something simpler. He introduced Sammy with a tone so sincere it cut through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean said, "you're about to hear one of the greatest entertainers in the world. Not one of the greatest around. Not one of the most talented tonight in the world." The room erupted. Sammy felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, not anger. Validation. He began to sing. Every note carried weight. Every lyric carried history. The audience listened differently now. Not casually. Not distracted. They understood this performance meant something beyond music. Halfway through the show, a ripple moved through the back of the room. Heads turned. The mob boss had entered. No announcement, no fanfare, just presence. He took a table near the rear, expression unreadable. Dean saw him. Sammy saw him. But neither paused. The song ended. Thunderous applause. Dean stepped forward. You know, he said smoothly into the microphone, in this business, you learn something important. Talent isn't given, it's earned. He glanced briefly toward the back of the room, not aggressively, not challengingly, just clearly. And respect, he continued, should never depend on who's watching. The crowd clapped again. The mob boss did not. He remained still, studying the stage. After the show, backstage security quietly informed Dean that the boss wished to speak with him. Sammy stepped forward immediately. I'm coming. Dean shook his head gently. No, not this time. In a private lounge behind the theater, the two men faced each other again. No audience. No applause. The boss spoke first. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. Dean answered calmly, no. I'm keeping it exactly as big as it is. The boss leaned forward slightly. You're risking long-term relationships. Dean met his gaze. If respect costs relationships, they weren't worth much. The words landed harder than any insult. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then something unexpected happened. The boss exhaled not in anger, but in consideration. You really believe in him that much? He asked. Dean didn't hesitate. I believe in what's right. That much. Silence again. Not hostile this time. Measured. Outside, the muffled sound of staff cleaning the showroom echoed faintly through the walls. Finally, the boss stood. You're stubborn, he said. Dean allowed the smallest smile. I've been called worse. The boss studied him for one last second, then extended his hand. Not warmly. Not warmly at all. But formally. This town runs on loyalty, he said. Be careful who you show it to. Dean shook his hand. I already decided. When Dean returned backstage, Sammy was waiting. Well, Sammy asked. Dean loosened his tie slightly. He's thinking, Dean replied. Sammy raised an eyebrow. About what? Dean looked toward the empty stage. About whether respect is weakness, he said quietly. Or strength. That night, Las Vegas didn't feel heavier. It felt divided. Because when power is challenged, it either hardens or it changes. And the next move would decide which path this city would take. Las Vegas had always respected strength, but it had rarely seen this kind. In the days after that last meeting, something unusual happened. The quiet resistance that had been building around Dean Martin began to fade. The delays stopped. The rehearsal schedule returned to normal. The canceled dinner was suddenly back on. No apology came. But the pressure eased. Sammy Davis Jr. noticed it first. They're not pushing anymore, he said one afternoon as they walked through the nearly empty showroom during sound check. Dean adjusted the microphone stand. Maybe they got tired. Sammy gave a faint smile. Or maybe someone decided this fight wasn't good for business. Dean didn't answer, but he knew something had shifted. A few nights later, the showroom was filled again. Every table occupied. The air thick with perfume, cigar smoke, and expectation. Word had spread beyond Las Vegas now. Newspapers in Los Angeles and New York had quietly picked up the story. They didn't print accusations. They printed admiration. An entertainer who refused to laugh. A friend who refused to bend. The crowd that evening wasn't just there for music. They were there to witness. Dean opened the show alone. His voice smooth, controlled, effortless as ever. He joked lightly, sang beautifully, and let the audience settle into the familiar rhythm of charm and confidence. Then he paused. I want to say something, he began, tone calm. The room stilled instantly. In this business, we spend a lot of time pretending. Pretending we're not tired. Pretending we're not scared. Pretending things don't bother us. He let that sit. But sometimes, he continued, you have to stop pretending. No names, no accusations, just truth. He turned slightly toward the wings of the stage. I've had the privilege of working with one of the greatest performers alive. Not because someone allowed it, not because someone approved it, But because he earned it, the spotlight shifted. Sammy stepped out. The applause came fast and powerful, like a wave breaking over the room. This time, it wasn't polite. It wasn't cautious. It was proud. Sammy stood there for a second, taking it in, not as a victim, not as someone defended, but as an equal. He began to sing, and something in his voice that night was different. It carried gratitude. Yes, but also release. Years of swallowing insults, of smiling through disrespect, of working twice as hard for half the recognition they poured into the performance. Dean watched from the side, arms folded loosely, expression steady. Near the middle of the show, a quiet stir moved through the audience. The mob boss had entered again. But this time, he did not sit in the shadows. He chose a front table, visible, clear. The audience noticed. So did Dean. The song ended. The applause thundered once more. Dean stepped forward. For a brief second, his eyes met the boss's. The room felt suspended. Then something unexpected happened. The mob boss began to clap, slowly at first, then fully, not forced, not sarcastic, genuine. The sound of his hands striking together carried weight in that room. People understood what it meant. In a city built on signals, this was a loud one. Sammy saw it too. He didn't react dramatically. He simply bowed slightly and prepared for the next number. The show continued, but the tension that had once hung heavy was gone. Afterward, in a private lounge behind the stage, the mob boss requested to see both of them. Dean didn't hesitate this time. Sammy walked beside him. Inside the lounge, the boss stood when they entered. "I was wrong," he said plainly. No excuses. No half-phrases. The words sounded unfamiliar in the room, but they were clear. He looked at Sammy directly. "Talent deserves respect," he added. Sammy held his gaze, then nodded once. "It always did." The boss turned to Dean. "You made your point." Dean shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "I made sure he didn't have to." Silence followed, not tense, reflective. The boss extended his hand first to Sammy. This time, there was no hesitation in the handshake. Outside, the strip glowed as it always had. Neon lights flickered. Music drifted from open doors. Tourists laughed, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place inside one showroom. But something important had changed, not just for Sammy, not just for Dean, for the city. Because in Las Vegas, a place driven by money, power, and image, as someone had chosen principle over comfort. And power had responded, not with punishment, but with recognition. Later that night, as they stood alone near the edge of the empty stage, Sammy looked out at the vacant seats. "You didn't have to carry this," he said quietly. Dean slipped his hands into his pockets. "I didn't carry it," he replied. "We did." The lights dimmed one by one. The stage fell silent, but the message remained. Respect is not given by position. It is demanded by courage. And sometimes, the strongest man in the room is the one who refuses to laugh.